Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dev Diary, where today we're continuing to work on our building action raft-like. Now, last time we began work on the basics, including the ability to extend the player's raft, the addition of resources to gather, a basic shooting mechanic, and a couple of enemies for the player to shoot at. Interactions between elements was also added, such as tile-dependent player speeds, and an enemy type that would destroy raft pieces on contact. Overall, it was a solid start, which we'll be continuing to expand on with today's plan. We'll be focusing primarily on resources and inventory, specifically collecting and documenting different resources. And we will also start attempting some type of crafting system that will use those particular resources. It's the first step in a long trek forward, so let's get to trekking. To make today's efforts easier on several levels, enums for resources and structures were added. Next, a type variable with a random value was added to the resource object. Then in the HUD controller object, a DS list was created that would keep track of the player's resource collection. A population function was then added to initiate said list, as well as a function to add resources to the collection. Then in the collision code for player to resources, the add function would, add one of the resources type to the collection. And finally, the list of resources was drawn to the screen. And thankfully, the results seem to be working just fine, with players being able to now collect resources, which are then documented in the list to the right. So now that we could collect resources, we had to think about ways to use them to craft stuff. And for today, that would be structures. So temp art for a workbench and stove were doodled up, and a structure object was added. Back in the HUD code, my new button system was then added with the addition of a page variable. This page variable would determine what is drawn on our menu, with page 1 being resources and page 2 being the crafting menu. With the draw code updated, a menu toggle variable was added, and then it was time to add some buttons. But first, a structure spawning function was added to make things easier. Then, back in the left click check, the mouse's position would determine which structure is spawned on the player. And the test, hit us with an error for the structure's quote-unquote type variable. And a good 10 minutes was wasted rewriting and double-checking the code over and over again. Eventually, I realized I'd used the wrong device input number. No idea how that happened, so I accidentally stacked both buttons on one another. So with those two minor issues fixed, our spawn code was finally in working order. Left-clicking in the craft menu would have the corresponding structure spawn on the player's position in-game. So back in the code, some tweaks are made, and then a couple build-related variables were added. These variables would control the state of the crafting event. Clicking on a structure in the crafting menu would now set the build mode to true and store the selected structure type. The structure would then be spawned when the player left-clicks again, which would also reset the build mode to false and allow the process to repeat itself. And the right click would also be a quick and easy way to reset the build mode to false. Initially, this did not work, but that was simply due to using the wrong mouse coordinates during the structure spawning phase. But of course, using the proper coordinates would in fact allow the player to now choose and then place their selected structures anywhere they please, while also adhering to our grid. Though this may change in the future, we'll see. Anyway, with that working, we can now move on to the actual crafting bit, which starts with the checking for the necessary resources. Now, I had no plan going into this other than to utilize GameMaker's updated approach to optional arguments and functions. Assuming the max amount of resource types for any craftable was 4, the function would iterate through the provided arguments and return whether the player had these resources in their collection. I then realized that this was already getting way more convoluted than anticipated, and with so little time left in the session, the decision was made to hold off on resource checking for now. Instead, a tile check was added to the structure placement code, restricting structures to only being able to be placed on raft tiles. And finally, the tile update function was updated to check for structures. If a structure exists on a tile that is not a raft tile, that structure is then destroyed. Meaning that, yes, those evil raft breaker enemies will also take out any structures also in their way. And that was all the time I had for this session. Outside of the annoying typo leading me on a 10-minute wild goose chase, this was a pretty solid step forward. The resource checking is gonna take some mapping out, so it'll likely be on the agenda next time, along with fleshing out the resource gathering aspects altogether. As always, there's a ton I'm excited to get to, it's just a matter of finding the time. Speaking of which, this brings us to the end of today's Dev Diary. So if you enjoyed today's entry, consider leaving a like, be sure to also subscribe and hit that bell if you haven't already, and let me know how you've handled crafting systems in your games. Also, I'm still open to theme suggestions, so leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.